Good morning and welcome to this special lunch hour installment in the library's signature event series. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming and Marketing at the Kansas City Public Library, and it's truly an honor to welcome you this morning for an important conversation co-presented by the library, the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, and Union Station, Kansas City. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you've not yet seen the library's exhibit, Pictures of Resistance, the Wartime Photography of Jewish Partisan Faye Schulman, you have 4 more days as it remains open in our Goldner Gallery through Sunday, October 31st. We hope you'll check that out. And if you haven't yet visited Union Station to view their current exhibit, Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, I would really encourage you to do so. You have until the end of January, and it's well worth your time. I'm sure you know Union Station has developed a well-earned reputation for truly top-shelf exhibitions and educational experiences, and we hope that you will continue to support their efforts. Finally, if you have questions this morning, we encourage you to drop those in the chat on our YouTube page, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So let's get started. Our program today would not have been possible without the help of a lot of people, among them Margaret Huang at Union Station and Shelley Klein and Jessica Rockhold at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And so it's a pleasure to welcome Jessica Rockhold to introduce our featured speaker this morning. Jessica has worked in Holocaust education and programming for nearly 20 years, with much of that time being spent at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. She started as the Director of School Programs and Teacher Education, later transitioning to Director of Education, Associate Director, and today serving as Executive Director. Please welcome Jessica Rockhold.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. This presentation is offered in support of both of these exhibitions that have been on MCHE's calendar for a great deal of time. The Faye Schulman exhibit is an exhibit that we were so excited to work with the library on and partner in 2020 and had been postponed then until 2021. And so the opportunity presented itself that we would be able to offer this presentation in support of both exhibitions, and it worked out perfectly. Dr. Kassow is an amazing mind on the issue of Jewish resistance, and that's something that often isn't spoken about enough in Holocaust education, and a piece that we wanted to highlight in this speaker series. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Samuel Kassow, who is the Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity University. He is the author of the book, Who Will Write Our History?, which is about the Emanuel Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's the author of The Clandestine History of the Kovno Jewish Ghetto Police. And his book, Who Will Write Our History?, is the foundational piece for the documentary, Who Will Write Our History?, which we were pleased to partner to show in Kansas City in 2017. So again, Dr. Kassow, it's such an honor to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to Kansas City. I'm sorry I didn't get to see the Faye Schulman exhibit. My mother and uncles and aunts were also partisans in Belarus, in fact, not very far from where she was. So hopefully I'll get to see the exhibit some other time. When we talk about the issue of Jewish resistance, of course, one of the first images that comes to people's minds is the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is the great symbol of Jewish resistance and highlights the justified heroism of the young people who fought that doomed fight against the Germans. But at the same time, in making the Warsaw Ghetto such a salient symbol of Jewish resistance, we run a certain risk because we make, willingly or unwillingly, an invidious comparison between the very few who had weapons and the millions who did not and went to their deaths. This invidious comparison was especially noticeable in the state of Israel in the early years of the 1950s. It was also very noticeable in the immediate post-war period in the United States. The ghetto fighters in Warsaw saved the honor of the Jewish people, as if the millions who died without fighting were a source of shame. Yom HaShoah, the Day of Holocaust Remembrance, was fixed at a date that was as close as possible to the date of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this tension in memory played out in the famous Ghetto Memorial in Warsaw, which was designed by the architect Natan Rappaport, and which is in front of the Poland Museum of the History of the Jews of Poland, which I worked on myself for 5 years. And if you ever go to Warsaw, and if you look at that memorial, which was unveiled in 1948, there are two sides. On one side, muscular fighters with weapons in hand, looking tough, looking determined. On the other side of the memorial, a row of hunched Jews, old and young, looking down at the ground, marching off into oblivion. Many Holocaust survivors who went to Israel remembered that in the early years, they encountered scorn and incomprehension. Young Israelis would say to them, we know how to defend ourselves. We know how to fight, not like you. Why didn't you fight back? Some survivors were even called by the pejorative term sabon, soap, which of course was very hurtful, to say the least. At the same time, Holocaust scholars like Raoul Hilberg talked about the passivity of the Jews, allegedly conditioned by 2,000 years of having to adapt to a position of powerlessness in the diaspora. This attitude, this condescending attitude, slowly changed with time. A key turning point was the Eichmann trial of 1961. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which relied mainly on documents and where the Holocaust did not play the key central role, the Eichmann trial relied on victim testimony. And a new generation of Israelis confronting the victim voice slowly began to acquire the empathy that they had hitherto lacked. And then, of course, the Six-Day War in 1967, where before the spectacular Israeli victory, there were those weeks and weeks of existential dread as Arab leaders threatened to destroy the state of Israel. And then the Yom Kippur War, with its initial defeats and its horrendous casualties, young Israelis learned what it meant to feel fear. And out of those experiences came more empathy for the survivors and for their experience. So to make a long story short, by the 1970s in Israel and in the United States, there was a growing realization that fighting with guns wasn't the only form of resistance. And in Israel, scholars coined a word, a Hebrew word, amidah, to describe a more general kind of resistance. Now, amidah literally means to stand up, but what it really means is fighting back against the German determination to destroy your dignity and your self-respect before they kill you. The Germans want to destroy your self-respect. You don't let them. You stand up for yourself. And if we take this term amidah, and if we study it comprehensively, then we see many forms of resistance. One form were the ghetto archives, something that I spoke about last night, where Jews like Emanuel Ringelblum, the organizer of the Onyx Shabbos Archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, basically said, we will bury time capsules full of documents. And even if we die after the war, those time capsules will surface and we will be remembered on the basis of our writings and not on the basis of German writings. A historian in Majdanek, just before he was killed, said what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. The Jews who wrote and who buried their writings were basically saying, even if we don't live to see it from beyond the grave, we will leave traces. And thousands of documents were found after the war. Had they not been found, then the Jews would have been simply a faceless mask of anonymous victims. But thanks to this cultural resistance, this resistance with pen and paper, we can write the internal history of the Warsaw Ghetto, of the Lodz Ghetto, of the Białystok Ghetto. We could write about social relations, about cultural life, about education. The Jews who were murdered have names, they have identities. Another major form of resistance was smuggling. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the official ration was only 200 calories a day. And if you ate in the soup kitchens, you may have 500 or 600 calories a day, which was also the road to slow starvation. But if we look at the Warsaw Ghetto, in the face of starvation and in the face of a raging typhus pandemic between 1940 and 1942, only, quote unquote, only 100,000 Jews out of 500,000 died, meaning that on July 22nd, 1942, when the mass deportations to Treblinka began, 80% of the Jews in the ghetto were still alive. How was this possible? One major reason was massive smuggling, not just little kids crawling through crawling through openings in the ghetto walls to bring home food for their families, but massive organized smuggling by gangs of Jews and Poles. And 90% of the calories that were consumed in the Warsaw Ghetto were smuggled in. Another very important aspect of Jewish resistance was the fight for health, the battle waged by Jewish doctors to keep the pandemics, especially the typhus pandemics, at bay. In the Kovna Ghetto, when the Germans suspected that there was typhus in the ghetto hospital on October 4th, 1941, they suddenly pounced on the hospital, locked all the doors, burned the doctors and the nurses and the patients inside the hospital, burned them alive together with the building. And so getting a hold on the typhus epidemic, maintaining elementary sanitary standards. This was literally a matter of life and death. There's also the story of the heroic doctors in the ghettos, like Anna Braudy Heller, for example, who ran the Children's Hospital in pre-war Warsaw and who continued to run that Children's Hospital in the ghetto. She stayed at her post until the very end. There's a document in the Ringelblum archive written by a man who's starving to death. And as he's walking back to his rooms after having eaten his one meal a day in the soup kitchen, he passes by the storefront where he sees doctors operating on a child. And the ghetto hospital had been taken over by the Germans, and the hospital had to move to a new location where everybody could watch what was going on. And he watches this operation through the glass of the storefront, and he asks himself, why bother? Why operate on these kids? We're all going to die anyway. But then he realizes this is one of the things that differentiates us from animals. Animals don't operate on their children. We still operate on our children. That means that we're still fighting for their lives. We're still human beings. I want to add that when the Great Deportations began and the Germans ordered Dr. Browdy Heller to prepare the children in the hospital for transportation, quote unquote, to the East, she gave these kids an overdose of morphine, thereby sparing them that terrible final journey. When we remember Jewish cultural resistance in the ghettos, we shouldn't forget the schools, the school systems in Warsaw, in Lodz, in Vilna, where children could go and learn and get at least one decent meal. And these schools were also a very powerful building block of morale. Survivors of the Vilna ghetto remember how in the spring of 1942, the children in the ghetto schools dressed up in their very best, declaimed in the auditorium, declaimed a Yiddish poem by the great Yiddish writer Y.L. Peretz, a poem which reminded everybody of their hope for a better future, their determination to maintain their faith in the basic decency of mankind, despite all the sufferings that they were going through. And I just want to quote a couple lines of this poem, which the kids in the Vilna ghetto declaimed. I'll say it first in Yiddish and then in English. Von unsere Tränen Teichen, von Teichen Yamim, von Yamim Amabel, omenit as die Welt is a Kretschme Belestin Belestein. Our tears will turn into rivers. Our rivers will turn into oceans. Our oceans will turn into a flood that will inundate the world. Don't think that the world is like a tavern without rules and without a judge. If we examine the story of Jewish Amidah, Jewish resistance in the war, we shouldn't forget the very important part played by self-help. An example of self-help was this massive organization in the Warsaw Ghetto, which ran soup kitchens, which ran schools, which ran refugee centers. This organization, called the Alleinhilfe for the Self-Help, was based on 1,200 house committees. That is, every building in the Warsaw Ghetto had its own house committee. And in most of these house committees, there were weekly meetings where you were expected to attend if you were elected to the board. That gave people a sense of mission. It gave them a reason for getting up in the morning and working. The very routine of working on the House Committee helped you cope with the seeming hopelessness of the ghetto. There was a sense of duty and obligation. One of the main purposes of the House committees was to make sure that tenants who were better off helped their poorer neighbors. While for the most part, religious observance tended to decline in the ghettos, it was still very important. And even Jews who were beginning to doubt God's compassion and God's mercy held on to religious observance just to have another way of holding on to their dignity and self-respect. I remember that my mother told me a story how in the early days of the ghetto, before anybody had any idea how everything would end, and when she was a teenage girl working as a cleaning lady in the German commandant's office, the commandant, who seemed to be more civilized than the others, once gave her some meat to take back to her home in the ghetto. And her mother was very indignant that her daughter would bring in non-kosher meat. Even though they didn't have enough food, the idea of eating non-kosher meat signified another dilution, another surrender of moral standards, which they were not prepared to do at that particular time. There's a story that in the Lodz ghetto on Yom Kippur in 1943, it came on a Saturday, and the boss of the Lodz ghetto, Chaim Rumkowski, managed to get the Germans to agree to make that day a day of rest so that Jews would not have to go work in the factories. And that Yom Kippur, which turned out to be the last Yom Kippur for most of the inhabitants of the ghetto because it was liquidated in August 1944, but that Yom Kippur, everybody left in the ghetto, 70,000 people, tried to dress in the best clothes that they still had, walking the streets, going to the synagogue, praying, fasting, a massive demonstration of a hope that someday they might be able to survive this ordeal. A cornerstone of spiritual resistance was culture, theater, poetry, song. In January 1942, after 2/3 of the Jews in the Vilna ghetto had already been murdered and 20,000 Jews in the ghetto were left, Jacob Gens, the commandant of the Jewish police in the Vilna ghetto, ordered the establishment of a ghetto theater and a ghetto cabaret. And initially, this order sparked shock and outrage. Underground political parties posted signs saying that there's no room for a theater in a cemetery. But Gens ordered the surviving actors to put together a theatrical performance. And to everybody's surprise, the theater was a big hit. It was very successful. And in no time, not only was there a ghetto theater, but there were cabarets, there were performances in Hebrew and in Yiddish. The Vilna ghetto was blessed with many poets and many songwriters. And some of these songs that were written for the cabarets became instant hits. For example, there was a song called Moshe Haltzich, Moshe, hold on, don't get depressed, don't lose it. You're gonna get out of here. In fact, I'm not technically qualified, but I'm gonna see if I could just play a little bit of this song on iTunes and see if you can hear it. Maybe not.
Moishe halt sich, sie nicht zu fall, halt sich fester. Moishe, hold on, don't let go now. Hold on tighter, don't be frightened. Weil etwas hält man, etwas fehlt man, Moishe, listen. The hour striking, freedom beckons, Moishe, hold on. Moishe, halt sich, sie nicht zu fall, halt sich fester.
So this is an upbeat tune. It's taken from American ragtime, and it kept people's spirits up. In the ghettos, songs became especially important. In normal times, an individual has his own measure of privacy and private space, but in the ghettos, this private space vanished. You were living 7, 8, 9 to a room. You became part of the crowd, shared feelings, shared fears, shared illusions, shared rumors, no newspapers, no radios. And what took its place were songs. And of all the forms of cultural expression in the ghettos, none was easier or more accessible than singing. One could sing anywhere, by oneself or with somebody else. And after the war, a Vilna Yiddish poet and partisan, Shmerka Kaczerginski, remarked, and I'm going to quote him now, in ordinary times, such songs would have taken a long time to become popular. But in the ghetto, we witnessed a wonderful process. Individual creations became folklore before our eyes. Every newly created song, which expressed the feelings and experiences of the masses, were taken up by everybody. And the bloody events were the creator of folklore. And hundreds of songs that became popular in the ghettos and camps touched on every imaginable topic: hope, despair, anger at the Judenrat, resistance, hatred of the Germans, loss of loved ones, the fear of death, and hunger. At the beginning of the war, before the mass murders started, many ghetto songs were upbeat. We Jews had survived past persecutions, and we would do so again. One song that was especially popular was sung to the tune of a beloved wedding song, Lo mil zechiber beten, let's forgive each other. Now the words were changed to Mir wollen sie überleben, we will outlive them, we will survive. Many ghetto songs derive their emotional power from the contrast between the lyrics and the tune. Lyrics that describe hunger, fear, and mass murder were set to beloved tunes from the pre-war period, such as that beautiful lullaby, Rozinkes mit Mandlin, or Afen Pripyatchik, that had conjured up old memories of parental love, family warmth, or pre-war visits to the Yiddish theater. We should not forget poetry in the ghettos. In the Vilna ghetto, the poet Avram Sutzkever wrote poems in the face of death. He really believed that the act of writing itself, the integrity and beauty of a well-crafted, honest poem, could transcend the terror of the ghetto and the finality of death. After the war, he wrote, "When the very sun became like ashes, I believed with perfect faith, as long as poetry does not abandon me, lead will not destroy me. As long as I live my life as a poet in the valley of the shadow of death, my sufferings will merit redemption." Believe it or not, he wrote poems while hiding in a wooden coffin. He wrote a poem commemorating his one-year-old son right after the Germans murdered him. There was one poem that he wrote in the Vilna ghetto, and the refrain is, "Beneath the whiteness of your stars, stretch out to me your white hand. All my words are turned to tears. They long to rest within your hand." And in the ghetto, this was turned into a song which became very, very popular. And I'm just going to play you a snippet of this. And when Vilna Jews were deported to concentration camps like Stutthof or Dachau, this song was also taken up by Hungarian Jews and by Jews from other countries.
Unter deine weiße Stern streck zu mir dein weiße Hand. Meine Wörter seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand. Seh es dunkelt, sehr finkel in meine Keller dicken Blick. Und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, seh zu schenken dir zurück. Und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, seh zu schenken dir zurück.
Now, having talked about cultural resistance, having talked about this concept of Amidah, in fairness, I want to admit that there were people who criticized this whole concept of Amidah. For example, there was a Yiddish writer from Vilna, Shloime Bellis, who spent the war years fighting in the Red Army and who stayed in Vilna after the war. And I got to know him when I was in Poland in the 1980s. He wrote a very controversial essay saying, it's really ridiculous to celebrate, as so many people do, the amazing cultural and artistic life of the Vilna ghetto, to celebrate the theaters and the songs and the schools. We should admit that culture was like a narcotic. It was a diversion. The Germans were perfectly happy to let the Jews have their theater and write their poetry because it took their minds away from doing what had to be done, which was to prepare for armed resistance. There's an Israeli scholar, Amos Goldberg, who complains that in Israel especially, there's a tendency to overplay resistance and heroism and downplay the very widespread trauma that really paralyzed people and robbed them of their ability to act. Now, Bellis and Goldberg indeed raise important issues, but I think they go a little bit too far. For example, after the war, a survivor of the Vilna ghetto and then of various Nazi concentration camps, Dr. Mark Dvorzhetsky, who was a physician, wrote his memoirs, and he said, yeah, when Gens ordered the establishment of the ghetto theater, I was one of those who was appalled. But looking back on it, I quickly realized that the ghetto theater, those songs, those writing contests, this played a very positive role because it fought depression, it fought apathy, it gave people a reason to hope and to go on. Another memoir was written by Yitzhak Zuckerman, who was the deputy commander of the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. And Zuckerman recalled how when the kids in the youth movements first heard of the Nazi mass murders in late 1941, And then they first heard the news of the death camp at Chelmno in early 1942. They kept saying to ourselves, we wasted our time. We spent the last 2 years in seminars studying history, studying Hebrew, participating in amateur theater. We were so naive and so stupid. We should have been preparing to fight back. But as Zuckerman recalled all this after the war, he realized that the seminars, the study, the theater, this was an indispensable preparation for armed resistance. This created the morale, this created the sense of self, this created the feelings of dignity and self-worth, without which armed resistance, the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto, could not have happened. So it's not an either or. And this notion of trauma is certainly an important notion, but it's too broad and it depends very much on the particular ghetto that we're talking about. So having dealt with the issue of Amidah, I want to then spend the rest of our time just making a very few general remarks about Jewish armed resistance. And we've heard this phrase, yes, Jews went like sheep to the slaughter. And that's a hateful phrase. And as we consider the whole issue of Jewish armed resistance, let's start with a few comparisons. The Germans took millions of Soviet prisoners of war, millions of trained soldiers of the Red Army. Most of them were killed or died of starvation in 1941 and early 1942, and we don't read that they engaged in a lot of resistance. If we compare the Jewish resistance movements and non-Jewish resistance movements, the differences are striking. Non-Jewish resistance movements like the French Maquis, the Norwegian Underground, the Polish Home Army, had a feeling of purpose. They had a conviction that tomorrow belonged to them. Tomorrow, when the war was over, they, the resistance fighters, would be the heroes and would rule the country. In the case of the Poles, of course, that didn't work out, but the Jews could not have that sense of tomorrow. The non-Jewish resistance movements had access to weapons. The Jews did not. On July 22nd, 1942, the first day of the deportations, there was a meeting of Jewish leaders. It turned out that their Jews on that day had a total of 2 pistols. When the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto broke out, Jews had 500 pistols and 10 rifles. As any military person knows, pistols are basically useless in a real battle. There's the issue of timing. The French Maquis, the French underground, understood that they would keep their powder dry and wait until the eve of the invasion. And then when they got that signal from London, that's when they would rise up and attack German supply lines. The Polish underground timed their uprising in Warsaw for the arrival of the Red Army on the east bank of the Vistula River. The Jews did not have that luxury of timing. They could not decide when they were going to fight. There was also the very key difference in place. The French underground could choose to fight in the forests, for example. The Jewish resistance fighters knew that if they wanted to survive and if they wanted to kill as many Germans as possible, they too should fight in the forests as partisans. That if they fought in the ghettos, they were fighting in a mousetrap. They were doomed from the very beginning. And yet, if we look at the chronicles of the preparations for Jewish armed resistance, the dominant mantra in Warsaw, in Vilna, was to fight in the ghetto. Why? Because a fight in the forest would not be remembered as a Jewish fight. It would be remembered as a fight of Soviet partisans. It was only in the ghettos that Jews could fight as Jews. And as one resistance fighter wrote, what are we fighting for? We're fighting for 3 lines in history. Now, those who wanted to engage in armed resistance faced terrible dilemmas. One key dilemma was the moral responsibility that you're taking on yourself. I might believe that the Germans are going to kill us anyway, and we have to fight back. We have to save our honor. And my fellow members of the youth movements believe the same thing. But next door in the ghetto is my neighbor, Mottel the tailor, who has a wife and a couple of kids. He's working in a tailor shop making uniforms for the Wehrmacht. And they've just gotten orders for 6 months worth of work. Does Mottel the tailor want me to shoot Germans to save the honor of the Jewish people, knowing that that will doom everybody? Or does he want everybody to lie low and hope that things turn out for the best? The answer is very obvious. Who are you to decide whether he lives or dies? Then there's the issue of dependence. It's no great revelation that the backbone of Jewish armed resistance in the war were kids. Kids whose parents had already been killed and kids who had not yet married and didn't have children of their own. They were unburdened by family responsibilities. But if you had a parent, if you had a child, you can't simply abandon those loved ones. There were people who on a train to Treblinka who thought of jumping, but a younger sibling said, please don't leave me, and they didn't jump. Let me give you 2 examples. The great hero, the great leader of the armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto, Abba Kovner, who later became a very well-known poet in Israel, a Hebrew poet and a well-known personality in Israel. When he led his partisans out of the Vilna ghetto, after failing to convince the ghetto population to rise up in the ghetto, his mother appeared and said, Abba, are you going to leave me? Where are you going? And Abba Kovner literally turned his back on his mother and marched out. And years later, in an interview on Israeli television, Abba Kovner said, how should I be remembered, as the commander of partisans or as a son who abandoned his own mother? I remember that my mother told me a story of a physician in her ghetto whose father was a rabbi and an elderly man. And the nearby partisans sent an emissary into the ghetto asking that physician to leave the ghetto and join them because they needed a doctor, but he wouldn't leave his father. And when the liquidation of the ghetto began, he walked to the ditch with his father, helping him undress, sparing him blows, and they died together. Can we say that he went to his death like a sheep to the slaughter? Or can we say that he was just as heroic as somebody who died fighting with a gun. If we look at the story of armed uprisings in Nazi-occupied Europe, we see a pattern. In the Białystok and in the Vilna ghettos, where in fact the fighters were better armed than in the Warsaw Ghetto, what they lacked was mass public support for an armed uprising. The public support was not there because in both the Białystok and the Vilna ghettos, there was effective Jewish leadership that made sure that there was enough food, that there was a minimal standard of sanitary conditions, and they made the Jews in the ghetto believe that if they worked hard and remained disciplined, they could buy time. And they thereby imparted a sense of hope. Confronted between the idea of fighting and dying and hanging on and hoping for the best, Jews chose to hang on. The fighters in Białystok and Vilna were isolated, and they did not have the support of the ghetto population. What made the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto so amazing and so unique, and the research of an Israeli scholar, Havi Dreyfus, shows this in more detail. What made the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto so amazing was that unlike other ghettos, the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto had mass support of the so-called civilian population. There were about 60,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. After the first phase of the deportations ended, there were about 750 fighters, but those 60,000 quote unquote civilians helped the fighters by building 750 bunkers. And without those 750 bunkers, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising would have been over in 2 days. Instead, it lasted more than 30 days. What was the difference between Warsaw on the one hand and ghettos like Vilna and Białystok on the other hand? The difference was that in Warsaw, the Jews did not have hope. They had lost any faith in German promises. And there was no effective Judenrat and no effective Jewish leadership to give them hope. And that vacuum was filled by the young fighters who basically told them, if we're gonna die, at least let's die with honor. And by the way, there were many Jews who believed by the spring of 1943 that the war might end sooner than we think. North Africa, Stalingrad, who knows? Germany might collapse very fast, and those bunkers that we're building, they might even save our lives. We also see another pattern, that there was Jewish resistance in the death camps, the Sobibor uprising, the Treblinka uprising, the uprising of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando. Again, these are all cases where Jews had their backs to the wall and where there was no real hope of survival. And then, of course, there's the story of the thousands of Jewish partisans, which is a story in and of itself. So at this point, I think I will draw this lecture to a close, and I will be happy to answer questions for a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Kassow. It's an incredible encapsulation of the variety of types of Jewish resistance. I'm wondering if maybe you could start by briefly addressing the conversation and the conflict between those youthful people who maybe were interested in resistance and the older leadership, whether it's the Judenrat or the ghetto police. What was that relationship like, and how did they communicate with each other?
Well, it was a very complicated relationship, to say the least. Now, if I could lecture for 1 hour on what happened in the Vilna Ghetto on July 16, 1943. That was called the Wittenberg Day, and that kind of encapsulated the relationship. Here's what happened. The boss of the Vilna Ghetto, Jacob Gens, had this very complex relationship with the fighters. He said, look, guys, when push comes to shove, when our backs are against the wall, I will be on your side. But in the meantime, don't rock the boat. Don't endanger the ghetto. And on July 16th, 1943, an informer tipped off the Gestapo that the commandant of the Jewish fighting organization in the Vilna Ghetto tipped off they told the Gestapo who he was, Itzhak Wittenberg. Now, this is a little complicated because this informant told the Germans that Wittenberg was a local communist leader. They didn't tell the Germans that Wittenberg was the commander of the Jewish fighting organization. In other words, he was wearing two hats, right? The Gestapo demanded that Gens hand over Wittenberg. The Jewish police arrest Wittenberg. They hand him over. Gens says we have to hand him over because otherwise the Germans are going to destroy the ghetto. As the Jewish police are taking Wittenberg to the ghetto gate, the fighters attack the Jewish police and liberate Wittenberg, and they go into hiding. Gens then calls on all the Jews in the ghetto to search every nook and cranny, find where Wittenberg is hiding, and hand him over. The fighting organization now calls on the Jews to rise up and slug it out and fight. We're not going to hand over our commander. And so the question is, will the Jews support the fighters or will they support Gens? Well, guess who they supported? They almost unanimously supported Gens. They all called on Wittenberg to give himself up. The fighters were isolated because the Jews didn't want to die. And his fellow fighters told Wittenberg he had no choice but to give himself up, which he did. Gens apparently slipped him a poison pill to avoid the terrible tortures. It was after then that the fighters realized that they were isolated. They did not have public support, and that's when they decided to leave the ghetto. That's just an example. When you had a Judenrat leader who was making things work and who gave Jews a sense of hope, by and large, the ghetto supported that Judenrat leader and not the idea of armed resistance.
Thank you. Can you recommend some of your favorite books or films that our learners could access and learn more about this topic?
Yeah, I mean, one film that I really love is The Partisans of Vilna by Josh Waletsky. That's a film made in the 70s. That's good because many of the former partisans were still alive and they were able to testify. So that's very important. Javi Dreyfus's book about the last phase in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto is very important. It's been translated into English. I don't know the exact title, but it's a very valuable book. I would also recommend the memoirs of Yitzhak Zuckerman, Zuckerman. And those are some books that I would recommend off the top of my head.
You mentioned that you saw the exhibit at Union Station, and one of our viewers wonders if you could tell us what you found to be profound in the exhibit and what you might hope that visitors would take away from an experience there.
Well, it's hard to give one simple answer. I think that one of the things that we have to learn from that exhibit is that Auschwitz was not another run-of-the-mill camp. Auschwitz was a place where many different strands of German policy came together. It was a hybrid camp. In the evolution of Auschwitz, you have reflected the evolution of the Nazi state, the constant rise of the SS, the constant ability of the SS to increase its power, to expand its area of jurisdiction. The exhibit raises interesting questions. One question being, why is it that Auschwitz has become the symbol of the Holocaust, when in fact most Jews were not killed at Auschwitz, and 2 million Jews were not killed in these industrialized gas chambers, but by shooting. And I think one reason why Auschwitz became such a symbol is because it had more survivors than any other camp. And because of the nature of the Auschwitz camp, there were many non-Jewish as well as Jewish survivors, although by and large, the experience of non-Jewish and Jewish prisoners was somewhat different. So Auschwitz is a place where different strands of the story come together. It's a very fraught place where memory conflicts, where Polish memory conflicts with Jewish memory, where Poles rightly understand that it's a place of Polish martyrology, where 80,000 Polish intellectuals were murdered. Jews rightly understand that most of the victims at Auschwitz were Jewish. You have conflicts between attempts to memorialize victims. These conflicts never end. So it's a very complicated place.
And let's end on this, another audience question. One of our viewers is interested in why scholars dedicate themselves to a particular topic. And so this person is curious if you could speak to how you came to this subject and why it's been the focal point of your research.
Well, I've had two careers. The first half of my career as a historian, I wanted nothing to do with Holocaust history. I avoided the subject, and I did Russian history, the history of Russian universities, history of Russian student movements. But I think it was after my parents passed away that I realized I felt that I had a kind of an obligation to study the Holocaust from the point of view of the Jewish victims, to give them a voice. Because I knew the languages. And I understood that for a very long time, especially in the United States, most Holocaust history was the history of the perpetrators. It was written on the basis of German documents. Very few scholars then were using Jewish sources. So that's what I decided that I was going to do.
Dr. Kassow, we are very appreciative of your time today, and I know that we've all learned a great deal from you. On behalf of the Kansas City Public Library and Union Station, Kansas City and MCHE, thank you for spending your time with us today.
Okay, well, you're welcome. And thanks for inviting me. Bye.